Thank you very much. You can hear me. I think I underestimated jet lag a little. So this time today I'm a bit afraid that I might fall asleep. Not you. Usually my audience falls asleep. So I'm going to talk about diverse, contrasting messages, ambiguous messages in nation building processes. And before going and talking about that, I would like to talk a little bit about myself. I grew up in Mongolia. I lived there 16 years. I went to school with Soviet kids, Russian language school, then I went home and playing with local kids speaking Mongolian, and at home I speak Kazakh. And back then it was a bit different for me. I could say we, meaning Soviet people, I could say we, meaning Kazakhs, I could say we, meaning Mongolians, and sometimes using them interchangeably or manipulating with them. So diverse messages were something I used to from childhood. Then I lived 12 years in Turkey from early 90s on, and Turkey back then was different from what's Turkey now. We had the government who tried to impose Western or European identity, while half of the people, at least some people, would object about them. And now we know that the country is turning into a system when the government tries to impose maybe conservative Muslim or Middle Eastern identity, while half of the population objects that. I spent some time in Hungary, a few years. Back then it was the country which would say differently from us, we're Western Europe. Now we have Hungary which says we're different from West. West is not valid there. So these are all contrasting messages. I studied a semester in Russia, St. Petersburg, and we all know that Russia is another country stuck in between West and East, Asia and Europe. And of course I'm from Kazakhstan, I live in Kazakhstan. This is another country which is as confused as any others, right? We also hear about different things. Especially when it comes to nation building, we could say that the government can say that we never had a statehood before the current regime, but we could at the same time celebrate 550 years of Kazakhanate. For example, we're a country which could say we're building a nation, but we're also not sure whether we're building it on ethnicity, building it as a civic model, or a combination of two, or maybe there are some diverse messages there as well. We also act as a rich country, hosting expensive, costly international events, exports, and so on. But we're also a country which cuts maternity support, we also cut pension. So this is basically the background. I'm going to talk about diverse messages, we also talk about practice, and we also talk about official rhetoric. I'm going to talk about peculiarities of Kazakh nation building policies. I'm going to look only state approach, governmental perspectives. I'm not going to talk about what's happening on the ground, but rather the official policies. Since I started talking about myself, my mother is a mathematician, my father is a historian, I grew up hearing about numbers and histories. So in this speech I'm also going to talk about numbers, maybe a lot, and histories a little bit less. Right. So, talking about histories, talking about the background. Of course, in connection with nation building, in behavioral science we have term, the Einsteining effect. Basically, it's a habit of people of solving the problem, and it claims, empirically tested, as many say, that we try to solve problem the way we used to solve the problem before, and we actually afraid of using new ways, or functional ways. And anytime governments, people, countries face with a problem, they use it the way, or they try to deal with the problem the way they used to deal before. When we look at the nation building processes, they're diverse throughout the years, especially in recent years we would hear about, for example, we building up a commission to modernize social consciousness, for example. That's a very vague and very weird structure. Anytime we have an issue, we have a program, we have a plan, 2030, 2021, 2030, some of them are duplicated, 2030 could mean different things. And it usually goes top down, there's a decree, and there's, I don't know, party program, and this follow. So nation building in Kazakhstan, to some extent, it's interesting that many of the habits we had before, we tried to carry on, or we claim that we tried to carry on. So that's the background. Now going back to the topic. Of course, I'd like to make it a little bit comparative, and for example, talking about nation building, we would bring an aspect what makes Kazakh nation building in the last 25 years different from, for example, that of Uzbekistan or that of Ukraine. Ukraine with big Russian minority, Uzbekistan, another country in Central Asia. And before we start and going to talk and analyze, again I need to come back to numbers. 1989, last Soviet census, and we have a country when ethnic Russians amount to 39.7%, with ethnic Kazakhs and with ethnic Russians amounted to 37.8%. Basically identical number. We have a country which is bi-ethnic. We have a country when none of the ethnicities, titular or ethnicity later makes less than majority. This is the numbers we have. Of course, a very unique situation. We didn't have that something like this in the former Soviet world before. On the other hand, another number, we have 4.5 million ethnic Kazakhs living in the vicinity, in the region. It makes in proportion Kazakh diaspora one of the biggest dispersed diaspora in terms of percentage. So these are the mathematics. And of course, when we talk about nation building, we can talk about a model, inclusive, based on citizenship, based on political civic identity. We could also talk about a model which would be basically based on ethnicity, an inclusive model, when more or less state tries to promote one core or titular nation and trying to build a state around it. When we look at the practice, we see that official rhetoric usually talks about an inclusive model, but practice and implementation brings on as a model, and the Kazakh state building, nation building, is an ethnic-based model based on Kazakh ethnicity. This brings in, like, we could talk about different theoretical aspects, an idea of homeland, what is the homeland, what makes it homeland. We could also talk about the idea of ownership, who owns this land, who owns this country, somebody born here or some Kazakh who was born outside, who has the legitimate right to claim that this is my homeland, and whose homeland it is not. So this is the aspect, all of this are related somehow to the idea of national unity and the idea of national ownership and legitimizing the system. When we look at the issue, there are lots of theories about ethnic background of ethnic violence. We also can see in practice, we have countries like, I don't know, Bosnia, we can talk about Ukraine, that ethnic violence is still very current as something which might happen where we would not expect it. And major theories about ethnic-based violence usually claim that the country is safer if what is called the core nation makes up comfortable majority, and also talking about those outside. If your co-ethnic group is dispersed around the area, that also makes it not safe. We can move back to Ernst Gellner's theory about what is nationalism. Basically, it's the idea that people of the same background should live within the political borders, or the basically ethnic border and political border should be congruent. So in doing so, Kazakh government from independence on had more or less two tools, more or less adjusting the mathematics. One is to let Kazakhs in, and another one is to not prevent non-Kazakhs leaving the country. When we talk about majority, when we talk about minority, of course we could talk about differences between different ethnic groups, but of course the major concern was about ethnic Russians, or ethnic Russians made up almost half of the population and the country. And that's what we could talk about as a system. I mentioned about Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is a country differently from Kazakhstan. Did not get involved with diaspora politics. Uzbeks abroad are very known, huge group. The Uzbek diaspora is not only in the former Soviet world, but far beyond that, starting from China, Afghanistan, and so on. But Uzbekistan, for example, differently from Kazakhstan, doesn't want to involve much with diaspora. They, as we see even in Osh problems and many other cases, they actually try to distance themselves. And the reason why we would see that, we would probably also base on numbers. At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, ethnic Uzbeks made up around 72%, 71.8% of the population. And within 10 years, they grew to very close to 80%, 78%. So Uzbeks, the Uzbek government doesn't need to rely on them, doesn't need them as any kind of backup for the ethnic building. And we also, considering that usually people coming from different backgrounds, Uzbeks from outside, from the regime point of view, were not very reliable people. Maybe we could say that about ethnic Kazakhs from abroad as well. We saw that in different problems that Oromas, the repatriates, were blamed for certain political action and so on. But when your numbers don't match, you could actually be more generous about that. And this is what the policies started to follow. The law of migration of 1997, which basically set rules for the repatriation and ethnic politics for a while, would clearly define, for example, the returnees as person of indigenous nationality, getting on with amnesty, ousted from the historical homeland and deprived of citizenship due to the act of massive political repression, illegal confiscation, forced collectivization, and other inhuman actions, who voluntarily migrated to the Republic of Kazakhstan for the purpose of permanent residency, as well as their descendants. And this is a very classical model of what we call the victim diaspora. People who are forced to leave the country due to political, military, and other actions have the right to come back. And for this victimization, usually allows them, without political guilt or social guilt, to put them in favorable position. And this is what, for example, the Kazakh government was trying to do. We could, when we talk about tools of how to make Kazakhs come in, and how to not prevent non-Kazakhs to leave, we could also see that, of course, bringing in Kazakhs, bringing us economic support, some legal support. We could talk about housing, we could talk about places of relocation, while although the government would talk about encouraging people not to leave and that we're losing specialists and so on, there was no legal measures to make leaving the country or migration difficult. Yes, we can talk about that our miners and engineers leave the country, but we don't do anything to make it difficult. Uzbekistan, for example, tried to put extra taxes for leaving the country. When you denounce the citizenship, you have to pay the money, which is quite substantial money. In some cases, the Kazakh government had to pay that, but in case of Kazakhstan, we didn't do anything else. We could talk about that we're angry that you leave and we're losing you, but when it comes to practice, nothing happens. And most of the, for example, when we talk about constitution basic laws, which would refer to returnees, later they were dealt with specific laws, and they're not visible. You don't see them, and basically people come and you don't notice them at anyways. We mentioned about Ukraine, and at the early stages of the collapse of the Soviet Union, we would hear that Ukrainian is one of the models when Russians and Ukrainians live peacefully. Many people would say that there is no differences between them. Linguistically, they're not dispersed, they don't perceive themselves different. There have been statistics that only 2% of Russians in Ukraine want to leave the country. In 1994, same statistics would show that 71% of ethnic Russians would like to leave Kazakhstan if cases emerged. Around 27%, if I'm not mistaken, were saying that they consider Russia as their true homeland. There also a bit more group would consider Russia as this historical fatherland, and so on. So when we talk about the premises, when people were saying that in Ukraine, Russians and Ukrainians basically don't distinguish themselves, maybe there's some linguistic differences. Russians and Kazakhs were different, and this was supposed to be a problem, but later we see that actually that division and the idea that we have people, victim diaspora, these people need to come back here. When we talk about other minorities, Polish, I don't know, Germans, other people from Caucasus, these were people who were forced to come here, so they're victims as well, and Russians, ethnic Russians usually would not put in that category. Russians are not victim diaspora, they were not forced to come here, at least en masse. They're not like Koreans or Chechens, and for that maybe they would not get any, I don't know, preferential attitude, or they would not get any subsidies and help for that. So due to these policies, many of them in tacit, when government was saying something, but in the meantime they were doing something different. By 2009, this is the last census in Kazakhstan, the Kazakh population increased by 26%, reaching more than 10 million, while the number of ethnic Russians decreased by 15.3%, making it 3,793,000 people, and the overall proportion made up by Kazakh reached 63%, while Russian population dropped to around 23%. Many other groups, like Ukrainians, like Germans, would drop even more substantially, and this is the time that things started changing. So this is what, I don't know, in nation building would call a comfortable majority of the core nation, and after that we have a policy, then the government started talking about civic model of nation building. For example, in December 2012, during the address of the nation, the Kazakh president introduced the grandiose Kazakh 2050 strategy. Among the huge number of issues, policies was also dealing with nation building, and he introduced the concept of the new Kazakh patriotism, Новый Казахстанский patriotism, according to which every citizen should get the feeling of the owner of the country. Everyone should get equal. Everyone should be equal, and there should be no good and bad ethnicities, adding that we are all Kazakhstanis and we have equal rights and equal opportunities, and the all Kazakhstani identity, according to the new concept of patriotism, should be based on the notion that every Kazakhstani, regardless of ethnicity and religion, is a full-fledged citizen of the country. The concept you would call one nation, one country, one nation. January 2016. The president published a huge article on official website entitled "The Plan of the Nation Toward the Kazakhstani Dream," where he lays out the Kazakh plan of nation building. It's a path of unity and gradual formation of a nation based on civic identity. He highlights multi-ethnicity is the most important value. The Assembly of People of Kazakhstan is the core of the Kazakhstani identity, as well as the amorphous Mangligel, the eternal nation concept, is the founding base for the government. As part of this program, there's also a decree on the conception of consolidation of the development of the Kazakhstani identity and unity, which also based on very ambiguous aspects and identities. Like, for example, Kazakh nation should be based on features like family, friendship, diligence, scholarship, and trilinguality. While elaborate on the principal direction of the formation of the nation, common future, формирование нации единого будущего. It's also another very big term. The decree on the conception of the consolidation of development of the Kazakhstani identity and unity becomes even more ambiguous, bringing in the following. Kazakhstani identity based on civic identity and national patriotic idea of Mangligel, supremacy of the rule of law, interconfessional harmony. Next one is even more ambiguous. Middle class is the basis of Kazakhstani identity and unity. Creation of tools for social mobility without restrictions, and of course trilinguality. This should be the basis of the new identity. In the meantime, I'm finishing. Coming back to the numbers, Russia still remains the leading country for immigrants. There's about 65,000 Kazakh citizens immigrated to Russia for permanent residence in 2016 alone, while the demographic studies based on current trends suggest that in less than 20 years, ethnic Kazakhs are about to make 90% of the country's population. So summing up, when we talk about, for example, Russian IT and dealing with Russian diaspora, often it was claimed that they use very ambiguous terms like Russian speakers, compatriots, отечественники, русскоязычные. They were very vague. It involved Russians, involved other people. So more or less the implication was that if you use vague terms, nothing changes. While the Kazakh government was very specifically targeting ethnic Kazakhs, they didn't make distinction, good ethnic Kazakh, bad ethnic Kazakh, from Soviet Union or from outside Soviet Union, while recently, after 2010 and these years, when constantly, today we have statistics that more than 70%, 73% of kids below age 9 are ethnic Kazakhs. Russians make up around 12%, so the young generation even more dispersed through this Russian Kazakh ratio. We have also non-Kazakh ethnicities like Uzbeks and Uyghurs having written comment of Kazakh above 60%. Russians amount to 6%. So while we started talking about these fake terms, as we might suggest about what Russia was using these fake terms and controversial terms, it's probably the act that we don't want things to change. Right? It goes like this, and of course, since we talked about numbers, demography would change things, birth rates, out migration. So without doing anything, in 20 years we'll have Kazakhstan with 90% of ethnic Kazakhs. Thank you.